I am going to go ahead and go because I want to get this started because this is all about Nisha and keeping my introduction short and sweet. So I am, for the people who are not in my class, I am Dr. Kelly. I'm a professor at Tulane, and I'm also the director for Tulane's Summer in Dublin program. And Nisha is one of the people that if you come with us to Dublin next year, you will get to see him live in person. I've known Nisha for,
I've been warned.
yes, you have been warned, for about 4 or 5 years now. And came across him at the National Leprechaun Museum, which is where he works. It's an amazing storytelling venue, and Nisha himself is a fantastic storyteller, as we're going to see today. He was originally trained as an actor, and then later being employed with the National Leprechaun Museum, really fell in love with the folklore and mythology of Ireland. He focuses on material related to death and dying, the supernatural, things considered grotesque or obscene within Irish folk tradition, which is a lot of all of it right there. That's kind of like a general umbrella capturing Irish
It's a
mythology.
fancy way of saying all Irish folklore, really.
It is, it is. It's kind of breaking it down and stuff. So if you enjoy this, please reach out to learn more about our Summer in Dublin program, where we use experiential learning at its best. We use Ireland as a classroom, and we go to these ancient sites, many of which are actually tied to stories, because the Irish are very literal in when they talk about places and myths and fairies and all the rest of it. And I've told Nisha, just to surprise us, that it's his show, so he's picked the stories for today. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of it. And so without further ado, Nisha, why don't you take over?
Grant. So, hello to you all. I think Laura really explained who I am and what I do best. So I'll just kind of jump straight into it. I don't know about all of you, but whenever I think of Halloween, horror often comes to my mind. That's the vampires, witches, ghosts, ghouls. Pop culture has taught me many things, and one of them is that if a supernatural attack is going to occur, it's going to happen on the 31st of October. Would you all agree? Of course you would. Pop culture can't be wrong. It's a form of collective consciousness. It's synthesizing the thoughts and feelings of countless people. And while individuals are often very wrong, it's rare for millions and millions of people to be wrong, which is a lie. I'm very sorry for lying to you, but people are very easily deluded. They're often staggeringly wrong about even the most basic facts of life. And all of these tiny little nuggets of misinformation get welded together with the gems of truth when it goes into pop culture. I'm very sorry. I promise I won't ever lie to you again. But to summarize, pop culture gets things wrong because people get things wrong, and that's really interesting. But why am I talking about pop culture? It's because to me, pop culture is very similar to folklore. Folklore is just an unconscious, casual culture. It's also a collective knowledge of a group of people. That can be as large a group as an entire nation, like the folklore of Ireland, or as small as the folklore that gets created when you room with people in college. Like, if you think for a moment of any strange rituals you and your housemates get up to, or any weird little bits of belief you have about the place you live in. Like, for instance, when my sister was at college, her and her housemates always used to meow the theme to Game of Thrones whenever it came on. And I personally, along with the rest of the staff of the Leprechaun Museum, are convinced there is a small childlike ghost haunting the new building, which likes to knock on our door every so often to freak us out. It's all folklore. Now, I do apologize for this massive digression. I'm going to try desperately to claw myself back onto topic now. Yes, ancient peoples associated this time of year with death and decay. It really makes sense. The beginning of winter, it was almost like the world was dying waiting to be reborn in the spring. It makes sense. The trees are losing their leaves, the fruit is rotting on the branches, the fields have all gone fallow. You would definitely feel as if the world had died all around you. And in older times, you were more closely tied to nature. This moving of the seasons, this cycle of death, decay, and then rebirth in the spring influenced the way they viewed the world and time itself. So while we consider time to move forward in a linear fashion, and even just saying time moving forward, people in the past would have viewed it more as cyclical, going around repeated cycles, much like the way we move through the seasons. And particularly in Ireland, they used to mark these changes of the seasons, these repeated patterns in cyclical time, with festivals. We used to call them cross-quarter festivals, in order. They were Imbolg in February, Bealtaine in May, Lunasa, again in August, and Samhain, the biggest of them all. I'm finally back on topic. Thank you for staying with me. Samhain was a very interesting time of year because in the Irish view of the world, supernatural creatures like leprechauns, fairies, banshees, and even the souls of the dead lived in a world next door to our own that we called the She. That world was only separated from us by a very thin veil. And at certain times of the year, like at Samhain, that veil would disappear. That's not to say these creatures couldn't come into our world at any other time of year. They could. The other cross-quarter festivals, the veil was even thinner than usual. And in certain sacred places throughout the country, for instance, the various fairy hills, which are said to be dotted all over the land, but if you went there, you might find a weak spot in the veil and go into the other world. But at Samhain, the veil wasn't there at all. All these fairies, banshees, ghosts, and souls of the dead returned to Ireland. And this could be a terrifying thing. To keep yourself safe, you'd often dress up in a scary costume to try and blend in with these supernatural creatures or deceive them. And the souls of the dead, you actually wanted them to come home to your house. You'd leave out a lit candle on the windowsill to guide them back to your home. This was a good thing. And they'd come in after you'd gone to bed and enjoy a silent supper in your living room. This was a good thing. But we weren't stupid. We knew that this little light on the windowsill would attract unwanted attention from much more dangerous creatures. So at Samhain, we used to light a candle and place it inside of a turnip with a scary face carved on the front, and you then leave that turnip on the doorstep to ward away evil. And yes, in the past, it was always a turnip that was carved, not a pumpkin. Why did it change? Very simple reason. Have you ever tried to carve a turnip? It is an absolute nightmare. Pumpkins are a million times easier. And it does the same business. Because I'm sure you're already asking yourself some questions, namely, why did the Irish people believe a turnip with a candle inside would ward away evil? It's a good question, but two things on that. One, have you ever had malicious fairies invade your home trying to steal your children when you've had a pumpkin outside your house on Halloween? Exactly. It is merely working as intended. And more importantly, well, to explain the second one, I've got to talk about Stingy Jack, which personally I believe to be a rather unfair name, but we'll get to that. Because yes, he was stingy. He would never lend anyone so much as a single cent. But the poor man didn't have a single cent to lend. It wasn't born out of meanness, it was out of necessity. He was a blacksmith and he was very talented at his job, but he somehow never managed to keep money. But one Samhain night, he heard a knock on his door. He opened the door to see a tiny man, all covered up in a bright red cloak. "Please," said the tiny man, "let me come into your house and shelter from the rain and wind." Against his better judgment, Jack agreed. "Come on in then," he said, "but mind yourself. Don't try to nick anything," which was a bit rich coming from Jack. He only had a couple of things in this life: the forge he worked in, his blacksmith's hammer, his wallet, which was always empty, and one solitary chair. But the man came in, amazingly, didn't steal any of these items from Jack, and the two of them passed the night together in pleasant conversation. I would tell you what they were talking about, but unfortunately I wasn't there. I don't know. Eventually, though, the little man decided it was time for him to leave. The wind and rain had let up, dawn was soon approaching, and he turned to Jack and said, "Jack, you've done me a service, so I would like to return the favor. I will grant you 3 wishes to spend however you like." And Jack instantly knew what he wanted. "Oh," he said, "amazing. I know what I want. Well, first, do you see that chair there? I'm forever falling off it. If you could make it so that anything that touches that chair has to stay there until I say it can get up, it would be amazing." At this point, the little man's brow furrowed, I imagine. Jack couldn't see under the hood, and I will remind you, I wasn't there. And he said, "Wish granted." "Great," said Jack. "Second thing, this wallet. I'm forever putting money inside of it, but whenever I do, something strange happens. I go down to the local bar for just the one drink, and I black out. I then wake up the next day in the company of a beautiful woman, surrounded by empty bottles, with an ear-splitting headache and an empty wallet. I want it so that whenever I put something inside this wallet, it can't get out unless I say it can." The brow furrowed further, but the little man merely said, "Wish granted." "Fantastic," said Jack. "Final thing, that hammer. I'm terrified somebody's going to try and steal it on me. And if they take my hammer, I am a doomed man. Could you make it that whenever somebody but me tries to lift up that hammer, it will weigh as much as a mountain?" And at this point, the little man broke. "Right, fine, yeah. You could have had the world, Jack. You could have wished for riches, power, money. You could have even wished for eternal life. But no, fine, you've made a mess of that now. I'm going, feck's sake. Wish granted." And with that, he vanished, leaving Jack to think over what had happened. On reflection, he decided he had kind of wasted the wishes. He was suffering from major buyer's remorse, and he really wanted a do-over. And as luck would have it was Samhain night, and he had heard that if you could find a briar which had re-rooted itself, forming an archway, and you crawled underneath it on Samhain night, you could ask for anything you wanted in the name of the devil himself. So off Jack went. He went, found one of these briars, he crawled underneath on his belly, and as he rose up on the other side, he said, "Are you there, devil? It's me, Jack." And he waited. After a while, he was beginning to feel a bit foolish, till he heard a cough. He looked behind him and saw Beelzebub himself, standing right there with a contract ready to sign. He then spoke to Jack in an impeccable British accent for some reason, and went through the contract with him. "Jack, it's really very simple. All you have to do is sign right here, and the deal will be done. I will give you enough money to live like a prince till the end of your days, which will number precisely 5,556. Because after 7 years, you will return with me to hell. All I ask is a very simple price, small thing, won't even miss it. Just your eternal soul to burn in the lakes of hell. Would you like a pen?" And Jack took the pen and signed his name on the dotted line. The deal was struck, and the devil went back to hell, leaving Jack with his wealth. Because in fairness to Jack, at the time, he thought that 7 years felt like a long time. I sympathize. 7 years ago, I believed 7 years was a long time. It's not. But Jack learned this to his peril. 7 years passed by practically in the blink of an eye. Before Jack knew it, time was up, and all of his worldly possessions would soon mean nothing, because he was going to burn in hell. And true enough, when Samhain came around that year, he heard the devil knocking at his door. "Come in," he said. "Door's open." And in marched the devil. "Jack," he said, "I'm afraid to tell you, time is up. You must now come with me to hell." And Jack threw his hands up and said, "Devil, you caught me by surprise, but look, I'm a man of my word. If you say time is up, then time's up, and I'll come with you to hell. I just need to grab a few things. As I said, you kind of startled me. I wasn't prepared at all. I'll just pack my bag. Why don't you sit on that chair over there and wait for me for a few minutes?" And so the devil sat on the chair. Jack went into his room, packed a little knapsack, and went out. "All right, devil," he said, "I'm ready to go." And the devil tried to get out of the chair, but he couldn't, because Jack had been preparing for the devil for over 7 years. And he remembered that anyone who sat on that chair was now bound there until he said they could get up. He was determined to make use of these wishes, much like anyone who buys a fondue set from a thrift store. Eventually, he looked at the devil and said, "Are you going to get up and take me to hell then?" And the devil said, "Jack, you have to go on without me. Go back to hell, find one of the demons, and tell them to come and rescue me. Don't really care which one, but try and find Jeffrey if you can. Just don't talk to Keith. Never talk to Keith." And Jack looked at the devil with wide eyes. "You're crazy. I can't go to hell on my own. I don't even know the way." "Why don't you wait there until you're feeling a bit better, then we'll go together?" "No," said the devil. "I can't, Jack. We have to go now. And I can't get out of this chair." "Oh," said Jack. "Why didn't you say so? Oh, I can get you out of the chair. No problem. One word from me, you'll be up. It's just one thing. If I'm going to do you a massive favor by rescuing you from that chair, I think it only fair if you give me another 7 years of life on this earth." And the devil was forced to agree. Jack got 7 more years to live. The devil got to go back to hell. And Jack went back to living and enjoying his wealth until the 7 years were up again. As I say, 7 years, not a long time. But the 7 years were done. The devil returned, kicked in the door, and said, "Jack, time is up. You must now come with me to hell." And as soon as he heard the devil's voice, Jack threw up his hands. "Oh, fair enough. Look, I promised you I'd go with you to hell. I'm a man of my word. I'll go with you now. Just, could I grab a few things?" The devil was having none of it. "Nope, not this time, Jack. You're coming with me now." And so Jack and the devil left the forge and started walking down the road towards hell. And as we all know, whenever you're going to hell, you're going to stop at a bar. As the priests say, bars lead to hell. So they were passing by a bar, and Jack suddenly looked at the devil and said, "Oh, devil, I'm parched. I didn't get a chance to get a drink all day. I've been working at the forge. Why don't we stop in that bar, have a quick drink, and then I promise I'll go with you to hell." You wouldn't send a man to eternal damnation on a dry throat now, would you? Of course he wouldn't. The devil was a reasonable man. He agreed that he and Jack would share one final drink together. And so they went into the bar. But as they were approaching the barman, Jack just started patting his pockets. "Oh, Jesus, devil, you'll never believe it. I left my wallet at home." "What? You don't have any way to pay, do you?" Well, it's a little known fact, but the Prince of Darkness never carries petty cash. So they had no way to pay for their drinks. Until Jack had an idea. Devil, he says, you can transform your shape. Why don't you turn yourself into a coin? We'll pay for our drinks with you, and when their backs are turned, you transform back, join me at the table, and as soon as we're finished the drink, I promise I'll go with you to hell. The devil was actually kind of excited. He turned himself into a coin, and Jack picked him up, reached inside of his wallet pocket, took out his wallet, shoved the devil inside, slammed it closed. And eventually, the devil started asking to be let out. Jack opened up the wallet tiny crack and said, "Oh, I'll let you go free, as long as you'll agree to give me another 7 years of life on this earth." And once again, the devil was forced to agree. Jack let him out. The devil went back to hell, and this time he was busy. He spent all 7 years devising incredibly inhumane tortures for Jack. He even managed to build a whole new circle of hell just to torture him in. And when the 7 years were done, he shot back up to earth, kicked in the door of the forge, and screamed, "Right, that's it. This time, Jack, you're coming with me. There will be no food, there will be no packing, there will be..." And he stopped mid-tirade, because at that moment, Jack turned around to face him with his hands in the air. And Satan could see that Jack had been crying. His eyes were puffy and red, and he eventually managed to blubber out, "Devil, thank God you're here. I mean, yeah, I'm so sorry. I've been thinking about our interactions over the last few years. You see, I've had a charitable turn recently, and I've been awful to you. I thought we were having a bit of a laugh, but I've realized I've just used you, and I shouldn't use people. I need to make amends. I don't want to start off a new relationship with you on a bad foot. Before you take me to hell, I've actually made you a gift. It's right here on the anvil. It's a bit small, so you'll have to get very close to see it." The devil just felt his heart melting. No one had ever bought him a gift before. And there's no way that Jack could have known. But Halloween was his birthday. So the devil went over to the anvil and he looked down. He couldn't see anything at first. It was very small. So he just leant his face closer and closer to the anvil until his nose was practically touching against it. And he still couldn't see anything. But now he could feel it. Pressed against his nose was the smallest iron crucifix he'd ever felt in his life. And before he could pull away, Jack took his hammer and placed it gently down on the devil's head. And the moment he let go of the handle, down it came with the weight of Kilimanjaro. The devil's head was flattened against the anvil, and he couldn't break free until Jack said he could go. At first, he merely asked the devil for another 7 years of life on earth. But the devil was a proud man. He didn't want to give in. He was annoyed this time. But eventually, he relented. One can only have one's head crushed by a hammer against an anvil for so long. He eventually said, "Right then, Jack, you have your way. Let me go free, and I'll give you another 7 years." Jack merely smiled. "Oh no," he says. "That was the deal at the start. The price has gone up. I'll let you go, but you have to promise to never take my soul down to hell." The devil had to agree. He went back to hell, and Jack kept on living and living and living, till eventually, as we all will, he sadly died a natural death. His soul left its body, and began flitting up towards heaven. Soon he pierced through the fluffy white clouds and saw St. Peter at the pearly gates, checking the names of those allowed into paradise off of his ledger. They'd come up, give him the name, cross them off, let them in. Till Jack walked up to him. Ah, St. Peter, he says, how are you? I believe I should be on the list there. The name's Jack. And St. Peter looked down the list. No, said no. Don't see any Jacks for heaven today. I'm sorry about that. I think you must have come to the wrong place. It's hell for you. At which point, he pulled the lever beside him, and the clouds opened like a trapdoor. Jack felt himself plummeting down to earth, then right past earth, and he awoke in near complete darkness. As he got to his feet, his eyes slowly adjusted. He thought he could see flickering movement in the shadows. He could hear odd chittering sounds, and he knew he wasn't alone, lost in that complete darkness between worlds. Well, not entirely lost. Eventually, his eyes saw something in the distance, very faint, a small fiery light, which he knew must be the burning gates of hell. Deciding that even hell was better than where he was, he started walking and walking and walking. He walked on and on and on in that near complete darkness. I don't know about any of you, but to this day, I'm actually slightly afraid of the dark myself. And anyone who shares this lovely phobia with me will understand. It's not the darkness that you're actually afraid of. It's what might be lurking inside. Essentially, fear of the dark is nothing more than a fear of the unknown. That fear was filling Jack now, till eventually he saw the gates of hell. Something he knew. He went up to the burning gates, gave a loud knock. Eventually the gates of hell swung open, and there, standing before him in all his diabolic glory, was Satan himself. Well, said Jack, we've had our fun over the years, you and I. What say you finally take me to hell like you've always wanted? The devil just shook his head. No, Jack. Don't you remember? I made you a promise all those years ago, and quite unlike you, I am a man of my word. But didn't I promise you? I will never take your soul to hell. Jack didn't know what to do. What do you mean? He said. You've been trying to take my soul to hell for decades. Where am I meant to go? The devil shrugged. It's not up to me, Jack. Frankly, I don't care. But I'm not a cruel man. Return to that darkness from whence you came, Jack. But before you go, last time we met, you had a gift for me. I have got a gift for you. And with that, he grabbed Jack by the nose and began pulling it further away from his face than Jack ever thought possible, till he grabbed a fiery ember from the depths of hell and shoved it right up Jack's left nostril. Jack's head burst into flame, eventually charring his skin. His eyes burst, being replaced by an unearthly, fiery glow. As he heard the gates of hell slam shut, he turned his now flaming head towards the darkness. As the fire died down, he still had those two lights in his eyes, and as he looked, like two shining torches, they lit his way, almost like a little lantern in the night. And so he started walking and walking and walking. And Stingy Jack has been walking ever since. Always lonely, always alone. Occasionally, travelers see his bobbing light in the darkness and try to follow it, but he treads over dangerous ground. One wrong step, he'll lead you right into a bog. You'll fall to your waist in muck and be lost to the world forever. But evil spirits knew to avoid him. This man had tricked the devil no less than 3 times. Anyone capable of tricking the devil like that deserved at least their respect and at most their fear. If anyone saw Jack's flaming head coming away, they would run the other direction, be they ghost, ghoul, demon, fairy, whatever have you. And eventually, we learnt this. We could see the demons running from Jack in the night, and so we mimicked it. We would carve a likeness of Jack into a turnip, place a lit candle inside to mimic hell's fiery glow, and you'd leave that turnip on your doorstep. A practice which does continue on to this day. Because it's why, back to pop culture for a moment, I think folklore is very interesting. We often think of folklore as something from the past, something that people used to believe, kind of the way that myth has now become associated with the word lie. Whereas folklore exists to this very day, and even ancient folklore still has an influence on us till, well, now. Those fairy hills that I mentioned, well, we're still moving motorways to avoid knocking them and fairy trees, other gathering places of the fairies, such as happened back only 20 years ago. They paid over 6 million, well, I was going to say euro, but I'm pretty sure we were still using the Irish pound back then. They paid a lot of money to move a motorway, a couple of feet, to make sure they wouldn't cut down a solitary hawthorn tree in a field. This solitary hawthorn tree is still on a little green island in that motorway to this very day. Why? Because you don't mess with fairy hills. The story goes that we banished the fairies from this land when we first came here. And I realize for anyone unfamiliar with Irish folklore and mythology, I keep saying the word fairy. You will all be forgiven if images of Tinkerbell have been flitting to your heads. I will clarify that Irish fairies don't have wings, and they've about as much in common with Tinkerbell as a Tyrannosaurus Rex does with Barney the dinosaur. They were ancient creatures. Some say they used to be our gods. Some say they were fallen angels. Some say they are the souls of ancient people that we drove from this land and are still angry thousands of years later. Whatever they are, they had strange powers. And if you crossed over into their world, you'd have to keep yourself careful. It was almost like a dream realm where they could make anything reality. And it's as if that world bleeds into our own. This happens on Halloween night and around those fairy forts. They say a fairy fort because most of them are the remnants of ancient Iron Age or perhaps a bit later settlements that somehow over the years have been associated with these ancient creatures. Some are even older, like Newgrange, Brú na Bóinne, which is over 5,000 years old, predating the pyramids of Giza by a bit, but anyway. These ancient sites were associated with these powerful beings, and it's something that resonates with people in Ireland to this day. Now, we're rational people. If you ask 90% of the Irish population, do you believe in fairies? If we are being polite, we will merely tell you no. If we are being accurate, we will accompany the no with a swear word and a very rude hand gesture, telling you where you can stick something in some part of your body. But if you ask the same person, would they be willing to knock down a fairy fort? Most of them will start making excuses about it not being profitable, or they don't believe in that stuff, but just to honor the old traditions, why would you mess with an important archaeological site? That's definitely part of it. But really, it's fear. You don't mess with fairy hills. And they'll prevaricate as much as they can, but eventually they will admit, no, they won't. I don't believe in fairies, I'll tell you that straight out. I wouldn't knock down a fairy fort, though. Why? Just in case. Because if any of the stories about what happens to people who interfere with fairy forts are true, that is truly terrifying. Like, for instance, there's a small town on the border of counties Galway and Clare. These are far to the west. If you have ever been to Ireland, you're in the Cliffs of Moher territory around now. And if you haven't been to Ireland, well, you should come this summer. Then you can go to the Cliffs of Moher and you'll know the location I'm talking about. Shanglish, small village. They'd recently gotten themselves into some trouble. They'd had a local weaver, maker of cloth, and he was decent at his job. He kept the town clothed, but sadly he died. They were in a panic, fearing the whole town would soon be reduced to wearing nothing but rags. When, as luck would have it, a new weaver came into town. They were delighted. They set him up in the old weaver's house and he got to work. He was amazing. Any bit of cloth you wanted, he'd whip it up for you, and it would be of the finest quality. And the people were grateful. Very grateful. They thanked him profusely, gave him what little money they had, but it was very, very little. They were poor people, starving farmers. They could barely afford to pay their exorbitant rents, much less afford expensive cloth. So they gave him what they could, and he, in return, clothed them with exceptional clothing. But he felt hard done by. He didn't hold it against any individual. He knew their circumstances because he shared them. He had rent to pay. He had a stomach to feed. He didn't have a family to provide for, but he'd never have a family to provide for if he couldn't get some more money or something. So he went to the people and said, "Have I not been doing you a good service?" And they all had to agree. He had. "And is it fair that you cannot pay me properly for the good work that I do?" People said it wasn't fair. "Then would you help me?" he said. "Why don't you give me a bit of land to grow my own food? If I could grow myself a crop of potatoes every few months, sure, I'd save a fortune." And so they tried. They asked around the town, all the big farmers, the small farmers, anyone who had even a small plot of land. Was there any space for the weaver? And all of them said no. No, no, no. But one man said yes. And he pointed at a fairy fort on his land. "The weaver can have that bit of land," he said with a smile, "if he'd be willing to work it." He was joking. He may as well have said no, but he thought it would be funnier to offer the fairy fort. But the people of the town took this offer to the weaver, and he readily agreed. No one knew why. One of them even asked him, "Aren't you afraid?" he said. "Of what?" said the weaver. "Them," he said, because he wouldn't name them. It's very unwise to talk about the fairies by their name. I'm personally taking my life into my hands by just telling you this story. But English-speaking communities in Ireland wouldn't call them fairies, and Irish-speaking communities wouldn't call them she, which is their proper name. You call them by nicknames, euphemisms, like Nadine the Maha, the good people, Nadine the Ushla, the noble people, the gentry, the other folk, the fair folk, the other crowd, or my favorite term, them. But the weaver just sneered at this man. "Didn't expect a good person like you to be afraid of some fairies. They don't exist. And even if they did, what would they do to stop me? Sure, anyone who tries to stop me from planting my potatoes in that fort, well, I'll take the skin off of every inch of their body. And with that, he raised an iron shovel in the air and slammed it into the ground. Nothing more was said about it. The very next day, he was going to that fort, digging with the iron shovel deep into the ground. Unwise. The fairies hate iron. Some say we could only defeat them in battle because of our use of iron weaponry. They don't even like the smell of our blood because there's traces of iron in it. So bringing a bit of iron to the fort, very bad idea. Digging into their ground with an iron shovel, even worse. That's what he did. He dug holes deep in the earth, planted his potatoes, and waited for them to grow. And grow they did. Quicker than he would have thought possible. The stalks of the potatoes were growing tall, and it was time to reap his harvest. He went up with his iron shovel, dug them out, and as he did, he saw the size of them. The biggest potatoes he'd ever seen in his life. The size of my head. And they were so large that as he was digging them out of the earth, he managed to cut one in the side. And the potato began to bleed. Bright red blood. He looked at the flesh, and the inside of the potato reminded him of a haunch of meat. Red and raw, flecked with fat and bleeding. They left a red trail of blood all the way from that fort back to the weaver's house. Because of course he took them home to cook them up and eat them. Why wouldn't he? He didn't waste good food. And unless it was blackened with blight, that was good food. Hard eating though. Even after an hour boiling over the fire, the flesh was still sinewy, like raw meat, and it left bloodstains all over his lips. The next day, a man from the next town over came calling on the weaver's house. He'd ordered some cloth that he wanted to pick up. So he went up to the weaver's house and seemed the weaver was still asleep. This is odd. The man was an early riser, but the man went up to the door and gave a knock to wake him up. No answer. But he'd come all this way. He wasn't going to give up that easily, so he went up and he knocked again. And this time the door swung open, and the wall of stench hit the man's nostrils. The smell of death and decay. He walked in and he saw the weaver. He wasn't dead yet, but he might wish he was. His body was twisted, like somebody had been tying knots with all the limbs of his body. His face was contorted. Couldn't even move his lips to speak. All he could do was let out a low. But his eyes were alive, darting left and right in a panic. And the man fled. Maybe to get help, but maybe just to run. Help is what he found them. People were alerted. The doctor was sent for. When the doctor arrived, he took one look at the weaver and said, "There's nothing I can do. The man's too far gone." But they didn't abandon him. They took him to a room, put him in a bed, and set a nurse to take care of him. She was given instructions to apply a balm on the man's skin with the hope that it might alleviate his pain. Didn't work. The man got worse and worse. First, as she was applying the balm, she noticed that his hair came off at her touch, till he was as bald as a newborn. Next time it was his nails. One by one by one. She found them discarded in the beds red and bleeding. Then she tried to get him to eat. She managed to get some food down his gullet, but almost immediately he started coughing and coughing and coughing and retching until eventually he spat something up in his hand. She looked and saw, swimming in the blood and bile, were a dozen glistening white teeth. Soon he didn't have a tooth in his jaw or nail on his hand or hair on his head. It didn't end there. One day she applied the balm and saw a red streak on her hand, and looking back, she saw his arm was red raw. She pulled the skin straight off him. But the next day, every scrap of flesh that had been covering his body was gone, leaving him a red haunch of meat flecked with white bits of fat. And he didn't last long after that. Because there's old ancient things hiding in those fairy forts. And hadn't he threatened to take the skin off of them? Which is why it's generally best not to mess with the fairies. We now see how useful having a pumpkin with a candle inside is. Otherwise, who knows what would happen to you on Halloween night? Because again, this all gets worse on Halloween itself. Fairies are said to move homes. They each live in 2 different locations, because if you haven't picked up on it now, and by the fact that they are called the gentry, fairies are definitely part of the 1%, at minimum owning 2 homes, usually a beachfront property as well. But it wasn't just them that would be out and about. He also had to watch out for your returning ancestors. Because as anyone who has dead relatives knows, some of them you miss eternally. And even though you know that in a sense they're always with you, some of them are right bastards, and you'd rather never hear from them ever again. You won't quite go far as saying you're glad they're dead, not with anyone in earshot anyway, but we all know somebody in our lives who probably has passed on that we just really think, maybe the world is better without. And sometimes even the best of people, when they pass on, develop a bit of a grudge. What's the saying? Life is wasted on the living. But anyway, we've been concerned about the returning angry dead since the dawn of time. In fact, out in the west of Ireland, they recently, and remember, I like history, recently is a phrase that can cover a span of over 200 years as far as I'm concerned. But recently, within the past 2 decades, excuse me, an archaeological team found several deviant burials in Mayo. Now, a deviant burial is thought to be a practice that would disable a body from rising from the dead, a la a vampire. Say a classic example is the old stake through the heart. But these were interesting. They'd had their legs and arms broken, tied behind their back, and then with a chain they were attached to a giant boulder and a smaller rock placed inside the mouth, so deep that it would dislocate their jaw. Why? We believed the mouth was where the soul entered and exited the body. We didn't want the soul getting back in, or worse, something else getting inside and taking over the body. And just to be doubly sure, even if something did get back through the rock into the mouth, into the body, and reanimated it, you'd be fine. They're not going to be able to walk with broken legs. That would be the hope anyway. Because there was this persistent fear of the returning unquiet dead. It's actually fair to say that we are a culture obsessed with death. So much so that at one stage, death was about the only time we could have fun. If you've never been to an Irish wake, I highly recommend the experience. This is a practice where you watch over the dead body for usually 3 days and 3 nights, even if now it's usually only 1. And now they're fun. You go to a house, you have a few drinks with relatives and loved ones, and you eventually tell stories about their lives, reminisce about them, maybe bitch about them a little. But in the past, they were described as wake orgies. They were specifically designed games to be played at the Irish wake. And speaking of wakes, one evening, a man in a town called Ballincollig, County Cork, died. So the local coffin maker was sent for to provide a coffin for the body because he was already smelling up the house and they wanted to get him into the ground quick. A man set off on a horse and cart and drew to the coffin maker's home. The coffin maker of the town, Dan Crowley, who was actually the wealthiest man in town. As my father always said, there's good money in coffins. And he had made a fortune. He was in such demand that he even had a whole set of pre-made coffins ready to go. So when the man asked for his help, he was ready to oblige. He went out back, took down one of the pre-mades, loaded it on the horse and cart, and they set off. Soon they arrived at the wake house. He helped them in with the coffin, placed the body inside, and he was about to go, because Dan wasn't much of a social type, didn't really go for parties. But before he could make good his escape, the widow grabbed his arm and said, Dan, surely you're not leaving till you toast my dearly departed husband with a drink. Well, you'd have to be an asshole to leave after that. So he took a drink, sat down, and as he began to sip, amazingly, I've had this effect before, the more he sipped the alcohol, the more he started to enjoy himself. It's weird. And eventually he was in a right good mood. And when somebody asked if somebody would like to sing a song, Dan got up and gave a beautiful rendition of a very, very naughty song I can't repeat for decency. The crowd loved it. They asked for another. He provided another song. And they were about to ask if he'd like to sing another, but he started telling a story. The crowd listened, enthralled. They had never seen this side of him before. He was becoming the life and soul of the party. And people were beginning to take notice of him. In fact, one woman was looking at him with desire. She was becoming filled with this overpowering urge deep inside of her to have Dan as her son-in-law. She was an old woman with 3 daughters. None of them had moved out of home, and frankly, she was sick of it. She wanted some man to come along and take one of them off of her hands. And she decided that Dan, best bachelor in town. She waited for him to finish the story, and then she sidled over to him, sexy-like, and said, Dan, do you see my 3 young girls over there? Bit creepy. 3 young daughters over there. I'm sure one of them would love nothing more in this life than to be made your wife. And I'm not sure what she expected him to do, but she certainly did not expect all of the colour from Dan's face to drain away. He looked at her pale as a ghost and said, Unhand me, demon woman. I will never marry in this life. I do not wish any woman to lure me into her bed, just so she can rip out my soul and tear away at my entrails. I should clarify at this moment that this was Ireland. Sex education didn't exist. And the closest thing he had had to sex education was a book he had found on the mating practices of the praying mantis, leaving the poor man a little bit confused. And it upset the woman terribly. She looked Dan Crowley dead in the eye and said, Bad luck to you. Sorry for the language. Dan Crowley. May you have a cursed life. You're not even good enough for my sweet, lovely daughters. You're not even fit to be in the company of us living people. Go back to the dead who you belong with. And Dan shot back at her. Well, damn right. The dead keep me in business. I'd rather spend an evening partying with them than with the likes of you. Well, if you like them so much, why don't you go and party with the dead, Dan? She said. Maybe I will, he said. In fact, anyone who I've made a coffin for during my long career is welcome to join me in my house this evening. He grabbed the nearest bottle of whiskey he could find and ran off. But you should watch what you say at a wake. Things are listening. And when Dan got back to his house, he saw a party well in swing. People were sidling in and out of the front of his house, some going out for smokes, some taking drinks, some relieving themselves at the side of the house, because unfortunately he only had one latrine. And his heart sank, because every single one of them was dead. And more importantly, moving around far too much for the way he liked dead bodies. He decided he'd leave them to it, and he decided to back away from the house, and he backed into someone. Turning around, he saw a skeletal corpse with not a scrap of flesh left on its body. Hello, Dan. It somehow managed to speak, despite a complete lack of vocal cords. Do you remember me? And Dan either didn't remember him or had lost the power of speech. Either way, he just shook his head. And if a skeleton can look hurt and depressed, this skeleton looked hurt and depressed. Dan, do you not remember? I was your first customer. Recognition dawned on Dan's face. Of course he remembered him. You'd never forget chiseled cheekbones like that. He then took that corpse in hand and marched into the house, because he suddenly realized all of his favorite people would be there. His customers. Sure, he wouldn't make a coffin for a person he didn't like. And in fact, he saw loads of his friends. There was Mary, who drowned in a ditch. There was his cousin Jimmy, limping towards him. Hello, Dan, said Jimmy. How are you doing? I'm fine, Jimmy. How have you been? Haven't seen you in 10 years. Ah, I'm dead, Dan. I'm doing feckin' awful. Have you met everyone else? And he had, but he decided he should reintroduce himself. Dan went around the house shaking everyone's hand, and as he did, hands came off in his, but he didn't care. Till music was called for. One of the finest fiddle players in the town, a man called Jack Lynch, took out his fiddle bow, and finding himself lacking a violin to play, ripped the flesh from his chest, exposing his rib cage, and began to play on his ribs. Amazingly, each and every rib sounded a different note, perfectly in tune. And as the music began, everyone else took to the dance floor. Even the O'Sullivans, who, God bless them, only had 2 legs left between them, and yet somehow managed the greatest foxtrot you or I have ever seen. And as the night got rowdier, Dan noticed a woman staring at him from across the room. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she began to slowly saunter towards him, swaying her hip. I say hip because the other one had sadly decayed away, but that hip that was left, my God. Dan had never seen a more beautiful corpse in his life. Her skin was that perfect ashy grey. She had that dead-eyed fish stare he loved so well. In fact, he began thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was the time to allow himself to be lured to a bed so his entrails could be devoured. And he took that woman in his arms and began to dance. As the fight broke out, turns out another of Dan's customers had been married twice while he was alive. And I do mean he'd married a woman, she died, and then he'd remarried. They'd all died. And this has raised several issues in their afterlives. Because as far as the first wife was concerned, well, this was still her husband. As far as the second wife was concerned, death had parted them. They began literally pulling the man back and forth, until the first wife let go, stared daggers at the second, and said, "You shouldn't even dance with my husband this evening, because you don't even have your own shin bones." If a corpse can go bright red, she did, as her husband looked at her and said, "Is it true, Eileen? Are those not even your own shin bones?" "It's true," she said. "Mine were broken, and to dance with you this evening I had to resort to asking for spare shin bones from my neighbour, Kathleen the prostitute." And suddenly realising that his second wife Eileen now possessed the shin bones of Kathleen the prostitute, the man flew into a rage. He began punching the air wildly. Not that Dan noticed. Dan was still wrapped up in the arms of his beautiful corpse. Till they paused. He stared at her and she at him. And he decided to go for it. He reached in for a kiss, which was hungrily received. Oh, it was like kissing a cold slab of meat, as their tongues began to wiggle around in each other's mouths. And then they parted. She smiled, Dan smiled, till he felt it. Her tongue was still wiggling in his mouth. He reached in, took out the offending appendage, and at that moment, a fist collided with the back of his head, knocking him to the ground. The man stared down and, realizing the whole reason his wife had to borrow new shin bones was because of Dan, he decided to choke the life out of him. He put his skeletal hands around Dan Crowley's throat and began to squeeze and squeeze as Dan blacked out and knew nothing till morning. When he awoke with a start at the dawn, he immediately got up and looked around. His house was empty. No scraps of broken bone or bits of decayed flesh on the floor. And that's when he realized it must have all been a dream. He drank the whole bottle of whiskey on the way back from the wake, but as he was attempting to rationalize the situation away, he felt it. Something still wiggling in his mouth. He let out a cough, and out of his mouth came a glistening white maggot. After he'd thrown up, he swore he would never take a drink again, which was a lie, and that he would never make a coffin again, which was true. For he retired the very next day, and ironically, after his oath, opened up a bar, because owning a bar allowed him to do what he needed to do every single evening. Because whenever the sun would set, he would think back to that Samhain night. And whenever he thought of that night, he'd remember kissing that beautiful corpse. And whenever he thought of kissing her, he really needed a drink. Which I think I might as well. Unfortunately, my throat's getting a little bit dry, so I think we might have to call it there, sadly. Except for Q&A, more than happy to stay around for that.
Thank you so much. Question for you.
Well for it.
Are there any rituals for Samhain, for what we would call Halloween, that occurred maybe historically? I don't know how much. I'm assuming that some of American Halloween practices have been brought to Ireland, as much as ones from Ireland were brought to America. So
like kind of a gross oversimplification of it is that Samhain in Ireland becomes quite Christianized after the Irish people convert to Christianity, and goes through a few little changes, and then goes over to America, where it encounters lots of other bits of culture, and then becomes the modern day Halloween. You can basically say that Samhain is a direct ancestor of Halloween, if not the exact same thing. Unfortunately, what we know of ancient Samhain practices is, well, we know a lot. What is actually true and what is actually the imagination of some very, very imaginative monks in Irish monasteries who are very enjoying writing while terrified they're about to be abducted by Vikings. It's hard to unpack all of those little disparate bits. We know that it was a time for feasting. So gathering people together and having a large meal, as many of us do, that is an old practice for Samhain. You used to celebrate over a week. You'd start 3 days before. You'd have the biggest celebration on the midpoint on Samhain itself, and then you'd continue 3 days after. This was partly for practical reasons, and lots of different practical reasons. The main one, you'd brought in the harvest, you'd taken all the safe fruit off the branches, you had your biggest stockpile of food you would have at any point, and a lot of it was perishable and would soon begin to go off. So you basically took, it's like those days when you open the fridge and realize everything is expiring, you may as well throw everything into a pot and invite some people over to have it. So you'd gather all the perishables together and you'd have some of the perennial foods. You'd obviously enjoy some apples, food still associated with Halloween to this day. You'd eat a lot of nuts, again, food associated with Halloween to this day, and meat, a lot of meat, because you'd cull your herd. After they'd produced offspring and then provided their milk, unfortunately, there was a lot of surplus. So you'd cull your herd of cattle a little bit, eat a lot of them at a big feast at Samhain. And I say this as a vegetarian, so I'm not condoning any practices here. But I think that kind of feasting element you can see to this day with the trick-or-treating. Mm-hmm. And trick-or-treating also goes to a slightly later practice, because when it comes to folk traditions and folk rituals surrounding Yahauna, as it would have been known later on, or Samhain or Halloween, they're a lot more easy to trace a direct link to. The practice of putting on costumes, you can link back to guising, whereby you would either put on a scary costume or just disguise yourself in some way. There's a lot of what academics like the term ritual cross-dressing at Halloween, which is always interesting. And you'd often go around the house to go around the neighborhood to gather supplies for a big communal feast later on. Now, by supplies, you might actually literally just try to gather a lump of turf to build a big bonfire in the center of the town, because as with all cross-quarter festivals, we like to light fires. That is an ancient practice. It's more associated with Bealtaine, but it was definitely going on at Samhain. And you would do it in the local community. You then come together and play games. Games were both for entertainment, but also to divine the future. Some people do think that Samhain may have been the Irish New Year. There's evidence both for and against. I'm neutral on it myself. But either way, it was a time to look forward to the future, and you'd play various divinatory games. And I think you can still see that sort of thing being reflected by the desire to, say, play with the Ouija board. This idea of supernatural and divination is still deeply associated with the time of year.
So what are the pros for it being an Irish New Year?
See, it requires a couple of leaps of logic. We go back to Gaius Julius Caesar commenting that the Celts of Gaul marked their sunrise, their start of their day from sunset, not sunrise. Mm-hmm. By that logic, we would start our year at the darkest point. We do know from a calendar found in Gaul that the year was divided into a light half and a dark half. And we're pretty sure the dark half of the year started on Samhain. Whether or not that does coincide with it being the actual new year, we're not quite sure. Some people are easily go, well, yeah, that makes sense. And we do definitely start start the day at sunset, which is why you technically celebrate Samhain on the 31st of October, even though Samhain itself is technically the 1st of November.
Right, which ties in with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Two Catholic holidays have taken it over and pre-opted it. And then with the Mexicans, it's the Dia de los Muertos. Same thing. And also happening always over a couple of days with that. So with like the winter solstice, because you would think the darkest day, so some from this time when the veil has disappeared to then winter solstice, and like the role of the winter solstice, because most people don't think of, or they think it's depressing having the dark day of the year, and why would you celebrate that compared to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think part of it, that if you look at it from kind of an outside perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's going back to that cyclical mindset. Um, ra- Rather than say Christianity and by extension a lot of religions which would have opposing forces of good and evil. Uh, for proper Christianity doesn't really go in for that as much, but the more folk practiced version, especially through the Middle Ages, was very much so that forces of good and forces of evil in the world. Whereas you'd see it as more just different types of energy. Death, rather than being an end, was a part of a process. And much like the earth dies and is reborn, there is some evidence that there was belief in some sort of reincarnation, the sense of being part of a cycle. So yes, when you're at the darkest day, the trees are dead around you. The ground is either soaking wet or freezing cold and frozen with frost. It's not a very welcoming time of year. It's many of us suffer from seasonal affective disorder because of the lack of sunlight. It's very unpleasant. But if you look at it with an idea of anticipation, from that day on, it's always going to be lighter. So you're celebrating being at the nadir because you're anticipating the rise to glory. And even as you get to the glory of summer solstice, that's fantastic. Longest day of the year. Every night from that time on is going to get longer and longer and longer. And given that the Irish are inherently pessimistic people, you better believe that if there were at ancient summer solstice celebrations, there would have been the grumpy old man in the background going, we're happy now, but it's only getting worse from here on in. And you can't say that when you're at the winter solstice. If anything, I think the Irish people like to be depressed a little bit. So if anything, we'd quite enjoy the darker half of the year. And there's also the focus. During the summer months, like we associate that time with being out on holidays and being out and taking time off work and partying at festivals. Whereas back then, July, right up until the 18th century, was known as starving July because you didn't have any food. It was all growing in the ground. And yes, you could see fruit ripening on the branches, but it wasn't ripe yet. Yes, you had loads of animals and their young, but you needed the young to grow up to adulthood and you needed the adults to keep giving you milk. So you were surrounded by food you couldn't eat. Whereas the dark half of the year, up till about the winter solstice, you would still actually have your reserves to be going off. You'd be fattening yourself up for the winter by having huge amounts of feasts and eating all the stuff that's going to go off. So yes, the weather outside is horrible, but the inside is lovely. And that's one of the different focuses. Festival Bealtaine and Lunasa and the summer solstice would fall in between those two. They were both outdoor festivals. You gathered outside to dance around fires, and people would run off into the forest. You'd gather flowers. Whereas Samhain and Imbolc, you take things into the house, and you're more likely to celebrate with your family and maybe by extension your larger unit in the community. But it was a much smaller internal focus, where there's an external focus for those festivals, and both would be considered necessary. You might have preferences, but it's like trying to imagine the darkness without the light, or vice versa. Light, by its very nature, creates shadow.
Right. Okay. That was a great explanation. Thank you. Do I have any questions from my students? Any questions out there? You can unmute yourselves, I'm sure. Okay. Great. Well, we have come to the end of it. Nisha, thank you very much, because I know it's late where you are.
No.
A little bit late. And I appreciate it. I send some of our sunshine and warmth over to you in
Thank
Ireland.
you.
And I look forward to seeing you next summer, ojalá, as the Mexicans say, God willing. And I don't know, can you wish somebody a happy Samhain, like you would say here? What would you wish?
Pretty much these days we mostly do call it Halloween when speaking about it in English.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think
Okay.
Happy Halloween or Happy Samhain would generally be the one. So I
Well,
wish
that's
you all
like
a very happy Samhain or Halloween or whatever you want to celebrate.
right. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.